What happened? Destroying that picture of Link was a secure thing.
I don't know. It didn't work. What do we do now?
Jeez, I don't know, but there's gotta be something else we're missing. Something else is making Thane act this way.
How are we supposed to even figure that out?
Think back. Is there anything that could help us figure it out? What did he do while I was gone?
Well, all he really had me do was just play games and then talk about them on the internet.
So what? Do we just play games until something clicks and we can save him?
I mean, it's worth a shot, but like, what do we start with?
Well, I was playing through Xenoblade 2 in my head, but we'd have to start over, and I guess it's not that big of a deal. I was only like 8 hours into it.
You know, you really need to get over this thing where you don't finish video games.
Hey, I've gotten better.
Okay, prove it. Finish it.
It's no secret that I have a hard time completing games. There are a ton of games that I've tried playing, only to realize that I didn't really like them and I would stop playing them. And sometimes I did like them and for some reason I would just stop playing them. And the Xenoblade Chronicles series was the same way for me. When I would start one of them, I'd get about 5 to 10 hours in, only to just stop playing for some reason or other and never look back. And this all changed with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. And I will still start games and then stop playing after some time, but if I like them, I make a special effort to keep playing through. For the longest time, I'd left Xenoblade 2 unbeaten after playing maybe 10 hours. It got hard, and I had no idea what I was doing. For the life of me, I just could not beat this one boss, so I gave up. But it still stuck with me, and I've always wanted to go back and finish what I'd started, but I never did. With Xenoblade 3's announcement in February of 2022, it was finally time for me to jump back into Xenoblade 2 and finish it for myself before the third game's release in September. Literally the day Xenoblade 3 was announced, I restarted Xenoblade 2 with hopes of finishing it before the release of Xenoblade 3, and I had 7 months, which was plenty of time, right? Well, on April 19th, Nintendo went ahead and pushed the date forward. They expedited it by 2 months, which at the time meant for me that I had roughly 3 months to finish Xenoblade 2. And I did it. I didn't do everything in the game because that would take somewhere over like 300 hours, but I did all I wanted to do. Was it good? Oh, it was damn good. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is one of the best RPGs I've ever played. There was so much that it did right that worked in its favor. There were some things I disliked and others that I heavily disliked, and we'll get to those in a minute. Before that, let me just tell you how good this game is. There is so much to like about Xenoblade 2. The world, the music, the cast, the story, the combat, and more. I'm gonna save my favorite bits for the end, so for now, let's talk combat. The combat in Xenoblade 2 outdoes almost everything that was good about it in the first game. I adore the combat in the first game, and there are some things I miss from it in the sequel, but I still think that the changes to the combat that Xenoblade 2 did were for the better. Just like in the original, combat is not turn-based, nor is it a straightforward action game. It's more akin to an MMO or a MOBA. Your characters do basic auto attacks, and by pressing the corresponding buttons, they can perform arts as well. Some arts can combo into others based on their elemental traits, and if done properly, you can do insane amounts of damage as a result. Each character has access to 3 normal arts and 1 driver art at a time, but you can switch between 3 different palettes by changing your blade during combat with the D-pad. Blades are one of the ways that Xenoblade 2 is unique from the other games in the series. Simply put, they are characters that come with weapons that the player-controlled character can use during combat. They each have their own set of arts along with an elemental trait, which, as stated prior, will allow you to combo specific attacks, increasing damage and damage potential when performing a chain attack. I'm really not the guy to explain the combat, so I'll leave it at that. The game itself isn't even very good at explaining how to play either. Actually, it's pretty bad at doing it. You are much better off watching Chugga Everything I Wish I Knew About Xenoblade Chronicles 2 video. This video is perfect for beginners, and I honestly think that it should just be in the game as a tutorial instead of what we actually got. After you get a ways into the game, I'd recommend checking out Enel's channel where he does more in-depth guides on each specific blade in the game. And that's the combat. I absolutely love the combat in this game, and even after playing through Xenoblade 3, I still think that 2's combat is overall more fun. It's a very rewarding battle system, and it encourages you to always get better at it despite the terrible in-game tutorials. Even though the game fails at explaining the combat, it definitely utilizes the combat to the best of its ability. Still keeping this section of the video spoiler free, I will be very vague about the context of what I wanted to bring up next, as well as use very out of context footage from this section of the game. With that in mind, the thing I want to show is more or less around the halfway point of the game, so I will still include a timestamp if you want to skip it. There is a specific boss fight that makes full use of the combat. This specific section of the story has the blades in a weakened state, and the fights that you have during this time reflect the plot point in combat. This presents the player with a challenge I really haven't seen all that much in other games. The boss fight in particular isn't really about strength of the character or how strong you got them, but rather it's a test of combat skill. The game really tests the player to see if they understand the combat of the game well enough to beat the boss. Personally, I struggled a ton during this section, even after knowing how to play properly, but it still was a really cool idea. Although, I can't imagine how anybody ever beat this section with the in-game tutorials alone. This section of the game did also make me aware of the game's accessibility features. You can change the difficulty of the game to suit your playstyle whenever you want to. I will say that I still beat the boss on the normal difficulty, but after the fact, I did up changing some of the accessibility options available. I specifically made it so that I wouldn't be targeted by enemies when I was in their vicinity because I was tired of being level 40 and walking past a level 5 monster who thought he could take me. I also upped ever so slightly the art recharge time. These changes made the game exponentially more fun for myself, and if you struggle with the game, I highly recommend looking into them. This is also one of the ways that Xenoblade 2 lets players have a unique experience compared to other players. Many people who see these options will probably change different things based on what they want, and I think that's incredible. The other thing that especially makes players' games unique is the blade gacha system. I personally think that this game mechanic is both good and bad. For one, gacha systems are fun. I don't care who you are. The anticipation of finding out what you're gonna get is exciting. That's why gambling is so addicting. But at least with Xenoblade, this gambling doesn't cost any money. Each time you get a core crystal, you can make a gacha pull, and for the most part because of this, everyone who plays the game will most likely play through the game with different blades. Someone may get the rarest blade on some of their first pulls, but not ever see a random common blade that someone else may have relied on through the whole game. This is fun because each blade really has their own character, and they also have their own corresponding blade quest. Side note, it's also really sweet that a lot of the blades and some characters had guest artists creating them for the game. When I pulled Perun, I instantly knew that she was designed by the person who designed the characters for the anime Code Geass, Takahiro Kimura. And just taking one glance at these characters, it's obvious that they were designed by Tetsuya Nomura, one of the lead designers for the Final Fantasy series. While I do like the gacha system in Xenoblade 2 for the most part, there is some things tied up to the mechanic that I despise. There is so much that is good about this game, and I really only scratched the surface. I'll be getting into more later on, but now let's move into what I don't think was all that good. In my opinion, Xenoblade has two massive things that make this game suffer. Okay, maybe four. And some small ones too, but overall my biggest complaint with the game is the pacing early on and the field skills all throughout. Field skills are abilities that blades have that can be used outside of combat. Essentially, they are glorified keys to the many roadblocks in the world of Allrest. There is a lot surrounding the field skill mechanic, and I basically hate all of it. I don't even know where to begin. I guess let's start with how to get these field skills. Each time you use a core crystal, you pull a blade from the gacha machine. You can either get a rare blade with a custom design and animation, or you get one of the many generic blades that fill the pool that you can pull from. Each of these generic blades can have a random field skill, and rare blades have fixed field skills. And that's it. It's basically all left up to chance to see what field skills you'll end up with. And while this idea is fine and can give players a unique experience with the game in both exploration and weapons they use, it doesn't work all that well when some of the field skills are required for game progression. In both the main story and side quests, you may come across a field skill check that you have to pass to progress. I hate the idea that progression is tied to a random chance when it comes to side quests, but the fact that it's also tied to the main story progression is atrocious. And look, I get it. You should in theory have every field skill you'd need at the time that you'd come across these checks, but in the slim chance that you don't, you're stuck playing the lottery until you get one. I never had this happen to me during the main story, but side quests were a different case. Honestly, I didn't do a lot of side quests in the game to begin with, but field skills were without a doubt the main deterrent for me to do them. For one specific side quest, I spent over an hour grinding core crystals just to get the one field skill I needed to complete the quest, and that was enough for me to never even bother with them going forward. Is this partially a me problem? Sure, but I bet there are plenty of others like me, so in my opinion, it shouldn't even have been an issue. To top it off, you have to make sure that the blades with the field skills you need are currently equipped, it's not enough to simply have them in your inventory. So that means that if you're not prepared to pass a field skill check with 5 random skills, you're going to be doing some menuing for the next 5 or so minutes to sort everything right to pass the check and then resetting the blades you actually wanted to use for combat. While this is a relatively small pacing issue, it's nothing compared to the terrible pacing that the beginning of the game has. The main reason I fell off the game all those years ago was because I didn't know how to play thanks to the awful tutorials, but the early game pacing definitely didn't help with that. It's not until somewhere after chapter 4 in the game that you even have access to all of the options you can have during combat. And that's generous. This is assuming that you got lucky on your gacha pulls and were able to get a wide varying amount of blades to use in combat. I think that it is worth it to make it through the slog of the watered down combat though. The combat is incredibly fun while running on all cylinders, so if you can push yourself through the drip-fed combat mechanics, it's 100% worth it in the end. These next issues are completely a me thing, but you may find yourself agreeing with how I describe them. I wasn't the biggest fan of Blade quests and exploring the world for that matter. This is partially due to my issue with field skills, but I also just didn't find them all too memorable. Finding secret areas was probably my favorite part of exploration in Xenoblade 1, but in 2 they don't seem as magical. Most are found by using field skills, and some you come across just by going through the main story. Blade quests are weird for me. I like some of the little stories that go with them, but for the most part, I felt that they were forgettable. I think this is also due in part to the fact that they weren't tied to the main story. I loved the main story, but the side stories just didn't grab my attention, I guess. Cutscenes are abundant in Xenoblade 2, almost too abundant. There were countless times I would get done with one only to walk 5 steps into another one. I don't know why they didn't just string them all together, other than maybe that some people might want to go do other things between them, but most of my issues with the generous amount of back-to-back cutscenes are near the end of the game, and at that point, I highly doubt someone is going to stop doing the main story that far into it to just do something else. I also hate the fact that you can win a fight, but lose in the cutscene. Mind you, this isn't solely an issue of Xenoblade 2, but I found it most prevalent in Xenoblade 2. Especially later on in the story when I really got the hang of combat, and I would just whoop anyone's ass, but then just lose in the following cutscene. I think this is counterintuitive for the player. You feel good about getting the combat down, but then the game still says, yeah, sorry, you still lost, buddy. Even though I have some issues with the cutscenes and pacing, etc., it doesn't hold back just how good this game actually is. People who have played a Xenoblade game typically praise the games for 3 things: the locations, the music, and the story. Some like myself also love the combat in the games, but I honestly don't hear about that as much as I do those other 3 things. We've been here before. It's that time of the video where I gush about the locations in Xenoblade, and I've got 4 for you today, so let's get started. Gorma is more or less this game's Bionis leg. It's got the music, the color green, and some breathtaking vistas. It's right near the start of the game, and in my opinion, really does a great job of introducing you to what to expect from the world of Alrest. Tantal is an area you go later on in the story, and it serves as this game's snow level. I love the castle structure you see in the distance as you make your way up towards it, and the music here, specifically at night, is one of my favorite themes in the entire game. It's ethereal and is an incredible set piece. The next one can be viewed a bit spoilery, so here's the timestamp, but out of context, I would assume that it wouldn't hurt to see. The land of Mortha has a stunning view with a solid piece of music to back it up. It is a bit surreal to see, but it also houses some unique story beats and was one of my favorite places to explore. And of course, if you know anything about the game, you could have probably guessed my favorite place in Xenoblade Chronicles is none other than Araya. I honestly think that Araya might be my favorite video game location of all time. It does the same thing that Satoru Marsh did in the prior game, where it looks sorta drab, but then becomes breathtaking at night. It has some marvelous viewpoints between Fonts of Mima in the background and the overflow of Sophronia trees. The music here is serene and adds to the calming, peaceful feeling that Araya has. But the music doesn't just stop with the areas. Its presence is made known throughout the whole game. There are so many tracks that are all composed perfectly. Xenoblade 2 is probably one of my favorite soundtracks of any game as well. What makes it so good is how well it can bring out specific emotions when it wants to. It can have you jamming so hard that you feel like you can take on the world, to feeling like you're on the verge of tears. The soundtrack is truly phenomenal, from its battle themes to its sentimental themes. I love it all. The music goes hand in hand in telling the story of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, more so than any of the other Xenoblade games. This is done with the simple use of leitmotifs. Throughout the whole story of the game, you'll hear the simple melody right from the beginning all the way to the end. Most of the pieces that are meant to invoke a specific emotion include this same leitmotif. Each time you hear it, the game subtly adds a new emotion to your memory banks, and as the game progresses, it goes from a nice tune to a nostalgic refrain that makes you tear up every time you hear it. The marriage between the story and the music in Xenoblade 2 is some of the best I've ever seen in a video game, and now that I've talked about the soundtrack, we can finally get into the story of the game. This is where the big spoiler warning is. I won't spoil everything, but I will also have some endgame spoilers, so if you don't want any spoilers, here is the timestamp that you can skip to see the rest of the video. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is the first video game that I've ever cried to. I'm really not the crying type, and it's usually pretty hard to get me to cry. Typically, only personal sorrowful moments in my life get me to cry, and besides that, before Xenoblade 2, the only other thing was the anime Clan ad. After Xenoblade 2, it sort of felt like my emotions opened up, and now I'm much more prone to tear up to media entertainment. Specifically Xenoblade 3, but that's for another time. Xenoblade 2's story is a relatively simple one, but it embeds powerful and personal emotions that I didn't even realize until the very end. You don't really even need to understand the full story to be able to understand the feelings that these characters have for each other. I love this cast of characters. They each have their vulnerabilities and something that you can relate to. They all have great chemistry with each other, and even the characters you wouldn't expect to get along have their own moments. I think that because the story is rooted in simplicity is the reason that I was able to connect with it more than other video games. Rex achieving his goal of reaching Elysium, but it not being what he hoped it would be, is a very realistic outcome. Nia finding the courage to be who she really is in front of the people she cares about hits especially close to home for me. Morag hoping to one day find a meaning to her life, only to be reassured by Zeke, is incredibly heartwarming and easy to relate to. And of course, Pyra and more specifically Mithra's hesitation to keep going on in life because everything bad that happens feels like she is somehow responsible is understandable, especially if you have similar thoughts about yourself. Even the villains of the story have unique interpretations that really give depth to the story as a whole. There was so much of the story that could and probably does make people cry, but none of it came as close as it does for me when Rex had decided to leave Numea on the World Tree. As soon as he realized she was staying, he instantly tried to go back to her. He could have just stayed and died there along with her, but he ended up making the hard decision to go and find life after love. As quickly as they were gone, they came back at the end, but it didn't feel wrong. The decision wasn't about overcoming the idea of loss, but rather accepting the choice of the one you love. And Rex did that. He fully accepted what Numea had chosen, and that's what makes their reunion sweeter to me anyway. No game is perfect. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 definitely isn't, but even with its faults, it still shines brighter to me than most games I've ever played. It took me way too long to finally get to this point. I pre-ordered the special edition at launch, was incredibly pissed at Amazon for delaying my package, and absolutely stoked to play it when I finally did get it. And while I did end up stopping back then, I eventually did figure it out and rolled credits. The Xenoblade Chronicles series has impacted me in many ways, and I'm happy that I can share that impact with other people. So if you've ever taken a glance at it and thought, that game is too long, the combat looks confusing, it's too hard, Pyra's boobs are too big, the voice acting is terrible, there are way too many cutscenes, the gacha system sucks, or what other excuse you might have had, I'd still recommend you give it a shot. You never know what you might end up liking, or what might change your perspective on life.
That was incredible.
I know. Why did I finish it when I first started playing it?
Well, what did you learn?
That the most important thing in life is the relationships you build with others?
Well, I mean, sure, but like, what did you learn about stopping Thane?
Oh, that we should love him and everybody else?
You're useless.
I'm sorry. I just can't think about anything else other than how the characters were always there for each other.
Wait, hold on a second. What did you just say?
That the characters were always there for each other?
Always there. Always there. The lube! The lube was there the whole time. That has to be what's controlling Thane.
Sort of like how in Xenoblade 2.
I'm positive. That's the only constant. Like, it has to be controlling Thane. But the only question is, how do we stop it?
Well, I do have the Monado.
Where did you even get that?
I brought it back with me for my coma.
That doesn't even... You know what? Never mind. It doesn't matter. You use that to destroy the lube, and I will distract Thane.
How are you gonna do that?
I have just the idea.